Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I have a special guest. He's been on the show before, and he's back for round two. We have the business manager of Ergo, Joseph Armeanio. Welcome, Joe.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, I want to thank you before we go on with the interview for taking this interview on such a short notice. EIP 27 has recently been implemented, has been in the works for the greater part of a year. And I felt like, since you have such a vast knowledge and understanding of mining, that you'd be the right guy to ask mining questions to. So this interview is all about mining, and
Sure.
we're going to jump right into it. So first question right off the bat, for those that don't know, Ethereum is finally going proof of stake this year, allegedly, and they're going to leave the mining business altogether. And GPU miners in particular will have two choices that they've never had before. They can either leave the mining business altogether and die with ETH mining, or repurpose their businesses and hardware to another blockchain consensus layer. So basically, my first question is, first and foremost, if somebody watching this interview right now is curious about Ergo and wants to mine something other than ETH right now, why should they choose to mine Ergo over other competitors out there?
Well, that's somewhat of a loaded question, so I'm going to kind of pick it apart. Okay.
Sure, sure.
In terms of the benefits of mining Ergo, I would say the heaviest benefit is going to be on infrastructure, meaning every miner is a business that has to carry costs, right? And so, being that Ergo is a little bit more efficient, you get electricity savings. Being that most of the time it does not run your cards quite as aggressively. You also have some assumed longevity on your hardware, and you also minimize cooling costs, right? So that is beneficial to the business model of mining. Now, in terms of each particular individual miner or mining outfit, it really depends on their business model. And what I mean by that is you have various phases that most people will go through. First is they get hardware, and their first goal is to basically pay it off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if they're in that phase, I am not going to tell them to act against their own incentive. Most of the time, they're going to simply hit what's profitable, right? And that makes a lot of sense from that business perspective. Just because you already have some debt you've incurred, and so then the primary objective first is usually, own your hardware, right? And so if you're talking to that class of miners and I were to say, hey, if we're, not the most profitable to mine at the moment, but mine us anyway, that's somewhat against their incentive as a business, right? I don't know if that's wise advice. Now, if you have people that can cover the costs of their hardware and they don't have outstanding debt, that's a little bit different. Then sometimes you get more into longer term thinking, right? And I do think that Ergo offers a tremendous, growth potential relative to a lot of the other proof of work coins, just based on its flexibility. So it depends where they are in their own. Let's say in their own business, because ultimately that's what it is. When you're talking about attracting people that have perhaps some outstanding liabilities and have carrying costs, I think marketing and it kind of becomes gimmicky in my opinion. It breaks down to numbers at that point. It's business. It's like if you had a rental property, right? There's a somewhat similarities in terms of the mining business and like rental, because you have the demand side of the market. You have capacity, which is going to be a big open question with Ethereum leaving proof of work, because suddenly you're going to have GPU capacity come onto the market that basically is outpacing the current demand of GPU coins. That's just is what it is. Anybody that says, oh, it's going to be all fun and games absorbing that much capacity, in my opinion, is lying. It's going to be a really interesting time for proof of work. You're going to have a lot of miners that are coming to new projects, and that hash rate is a blessing and, potentially a curse. It's going to be a fun ride, is all I can say.
Well, no, yeah, no, good answer. Yeah. So to keep my opinion out of it, for the sake of time for this interview, I'm not going to respond to all your answers. I'll let people interpret it however they will. I'll just move on to the next question. So now that EIP 27 has rolled out successfully, block rewards have gone down 12 ERG. And soon enough, an additional 3 ERG will also be deducted in a couple of days from the recording of this interview. With mining profitability taking a hit short term and all of crypto currently being in a bear market, we're actually still seeing a steady amount of overall hash rate for Ergo. In fact, it's actually slightly higher than what it was before EIP 27. What do you attribute that resiliency to?
I think there's a couple of factors. Number one, it depends on the let's say miners' responsiveness. You do have some miners that are there every day checking, what to mine and moving their rigs around. And then you do have a certain class of miners that are more set, create stability in your settings, and kind of forget about it, right? To where, just because markets move, there are, some traders, and the same thing. There are some traders that are always like reacting to whatever the movement of the day is. And then you have some that are just kind of sitting there doing their thing. They perhaps DCA, and mining is a way to come into the crypto market with hardware versus just with, monetary investment. So you do actually have miners that their primary goal is to, get into projects, but without exposure to exchanges, KYC requirements, that type of fun stuff that comes from like the investor side. So it depends on the miner's intent and ultimate game plan, and that's really not singular across the industry. You do have some that are, let's say, somewhat crypto agnostic, right? Their biggest goal is to stack hardware. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to use the profitability of proof of work to invest and build actual hardware locally. And then you have some people that use it as a mechanism to support networks. You have some that use it as a mechanism to kind of cost average into things, to where they mine over time and just accumulate because they have kind of like a more of an investment thesis versus a ROI infrastructure based game plan. So there's variability in each individual miner's goals, right? And it's hard to speak to that singularly. I do think that having reduced rewards is always painful for mining. That's not like a EIP 27 specific event. Even whenever Bitcoin would have, right? Suddenly what happens is you have less coins in circulation, and usually things trend towards the people with the most efficient setup. And that is not just their miners, it's also their infrastructure costs, right? Because they're profitable at that lower reward. And then generally what happens is they start to kind of grow and accumulate more of the tokens. And oftentimes, being that they have a certain sense that, okay, they're the most profitable, they're kind of like the bottom of the market, they hold. And then naturally we see like this Bitcoin halving price jubilee that everyone tends to like celebrate and look forward to. A lot of that actually comes from the miners that basically have the lowest input cost being able to hold at that point, and then other miners come online and the profitability tends to come back. So that's always some oscillating factor in mining whenever you have reduced rewards.
Yeah, tying into that conversation about reduced rewards and short-term pain for long-term sustainability at heart, right? That was the purpose of EIP 27. early 2022, we started with 66 ERG per block reward. And sometime in 2027, it'll be down to just 3 ERG per block reward. That's over an 85% drop in overall rewards over a range of a mere 5 to 6 years. Yep. So as we do increase in hash rate and continue to decrease rewards, how can Ergo best absorb these dramatic shifts and ultimately ensure miner profitability long term, if there's any way to ensure it at all?
Sure. I think the best thing we can do to deliver profitability to miners is really expand how multi-asset proof of work is kind of progressing in the Ergo ecosystem, right? So we do have a lot of growth in that area that's actually relatively new in mining in general, where a project can either take a portion of their token rewards, which we've seen so far, and use that as a way to attract miners. Which one of the benefits of proof of work that's somewhat hidden is proof of work is incredibly good at bootstrapping communities, right? Like if you look at even something like, let's just say Ravencoin, right? Ravencoin is a miner-driven community. It built around miners versus proof of stake tends to be a little bit more insular, because when you initially buy or hold a token, there's a certain incentive like to just stay there, and it doesn't really have the same incentive to decentralize. Versus if there's a profit incentive, it tends to bring new people into that space and is really kind of magic in terms of forming a community around that. So there is a big benefit to projects launching via work, because you naturally have that, let's say, community accumulation factor if the profitability is right. Now, one thing we have not seen that I hope that we see in let's say this next year is actually a project that builds on top of Ergo and actually launches fully from work, right? Like Neta, Comet, I really respect that they're engaging miners, but to some degree they already had their emission over here. They already had tokens on market. So to some degree, it's a little backwards versus how proof of work usually works, where the miners are the initial token distribution factor. Where they're
no,
first.
Go ahead, continue.
Yeah, they're first to basically mine tokens, so they're kind of like the foundation. And in launching multi-asset proof of work, where projects have the ability to use work to distribute tokens, having miners actually be like the first value creation. They in essence are the ones that unlock the token, so to speak, is going to be really interesting to see, because that's going to deliver a lot more value versus kind of diluting a market that already exists.
Right. I have comments on that, and we'll get to I suppose a more broader discussion about your responses after I get through these questions. So 51% attacks are a real threat to any proof of work blockchain. Nobody wants to see it occur. At least any non-malicious actor doesn't want to see it occur. Nanopool still holds about a third of Ergo's overall mining pool's hash rate. How can we effectively continue to dissuade miners from centralizing their hash power to the most profitable top mining pool, and actually, incentivize them to decentralize their hash power across various pools, when the bottom line of a mining business is typically just to get the highest payout in the first place, which would naturally tempt miners to the top pool?
There's a time incentive that you have to look at, number one, right? So in a short period of time, that let's say Nanopool is going to tend to hit more blocks, right? Over a long period of time, you're basically over a long enough period of time, any miner is going to basically mine the rewards that reflect their hash rate. So like a smaller pool over time will be just as profitable as nano pool because it holds, X amount of percentage of hash rate. It's something that I think just has to do with time horizons, right? So if you're come into the Ergo ecosystem and you have a short-term time horizon, the incentive is going to be to mine the biggest pool. Now your rewards will be smaller because they're more distributed, and your hash rate as an individual represents a smaller portion of it. So that factor is always going to be at play. Like, what is the miner's time horizon in the network? We do have a lot of miners that still are into solo mining, which is great to see. That's kind of where Ergo came from. But solo mining is like, okay, let's mine for a week, and depending on how big your hash rate is, you might hit a block, right? Which that might represent a portion of your hash rate in the network. But if you hit 2 blocks, you're kind of in the money. And then you may have a week where you don't hit any blocks, and that's painful. But they having a larger pool just reflects time in proof of work. Little pools over time are just as profitable. They represent the same share of the network, and they get a block reward that is pretty much even to a larger pool. It's just it takes more time to let's say you represent a small percentage of the network. You have to run through X blocks before you're probably going to hit one.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were done.
Yeah, so in terms of like pool shares, time is a big factor. The other thing is it's a service-oriented business. Why would a miner choose nano pool versus Woolly Poly or a smaller pool? To some degree, that has to also be, let's just say, its own unique market competition, right? Like if they're offering better software, better services, better user experience, then to some degree, the biggest competitor that needs to emerge is other pools themselves, right? If you were going to have like 10 burger restaurants in town and one of them is outperforming everyone else, you could say, well, guys, it's not good for the other restaurants, but to some degree, as a business, they need to step up.
Yeah, the burden and competition lays with the pools themselves at the end of the day to attract miners. Ethics can only take you so far that you should.
Yeah, it gets into a problem where I could say, okay, guys, this is like the ethical choice, or this, whatever ethical means here, or this is like the choice that's best for the network. But to some degree, I think it's stupid over time to try to talk people to work against their own incentive. That doesn't work. Like, you can't run proof of work on altruism. It's a business.
The follow-up question to that comes out of what you've said. Do you think the things that you're mentioning about time horizons and how small pools ultimately, everything, whether they're large or small pools, kind of comes out in the wash because of the proportion of the percentage of when you hit a block reward, you're contributing to that pool. And if it's a larger one, you make up a smaller percentage. If it's a smaller pool, you make up a larger percentage. It kind of long-term kind of evens out the playing field. Do you think those incentives that you're talking about are well understood to miners because they've always mined for the most part ETH? And they've never had to really think about time horizons, only short-term profitability, in my opinion.
I think to some degree, miners do think about it. Like there's even little factors. Like if I'm a miner, I might want to test every pool's ping time. How quick does my computer connect to their server, right? And that's going to vary depending on what pool, where their server is located, and how quickly I'm able to connect, because that does give me a small advantage. So even server infrastructure is something miners might look at, where if I'm connecting in a matter of milliseconds to one, and the number is like 4 or 5 times higher on potentially another pool, I may be able to submit more shares to that one, even if it's a small percentage. That will add up, over time. So you have infrastructure, imbalances that miners are going to look at for newer miners, documentation and onboarding, and usually larger pools have done a really good job at having, guides, videos, support structure for onboarding new miners, versus a lot of the smaller pools probably are lacking on just that basic educational side. So there's hardware factors, there's educational factors, and there's also software where they may be running a particular mining software that, based on whatever GPUs they're running, it simply is a little bit more performant or efficient, with one particular pool, and so they go to that pool. I mean, sometimes when you look like net, miners are really good at maximizing their efficiency, and so small improvements is often something they spend a lot of time playing with. Whether it's their cards, their ping time, they're just trying to maximize their return, which is their incentive. So it's very difficult understanding, like, okay, if you want to attract miners to your pool, you have to look at all of those factors, and depending on who the miner is, what their experience is, and to some degree what their time horizon is, you'll attract them. But it'd be easy if it were like there's a single miner, there's a flavor of miners, and usually they are very focused on their business, because ultimately that's what it is.
Yeah, we touched on a bit of kind of Autolocus, and that's Ergo's unique mining protocol. So very briefly, I'd like to discuss the value propositions of Autolocus that maybe people aren't normally aware of. They know it's good. They know it's good for their GPUs generally, but they don't really have it's kind of overlooked when you look at all of the different aspects of what Ergo does better, right? So for those watching this interview who may not be aware, I got this straight from the website, not my words. I quote, Ergo mining is based on Autolocus, an ASIC-resistant proof-of-work algorithm written in Scala. It can run on most low-end GPUs at lower temperatures than other algorithms, which increases mining equipment longevity. Combined with the extended UTXO model and shifting the heavy lifting off-chain, this creates a highly efficient proof-of-work mining algorithm. So with all that being said, end quote, do you think the efficiency of actual mining protocols used for particular assets are given enough importance or thought from miners themselves as it pertains to how running protocols can affect certain GPU cards and their effective lifespans? You kind of touched on that miners, they really meticulous. Yeah.
It's an infrastructure benefit, right? People think efficiency, and to some degree, I think like on the ESG green side, it's a stupid thing to promote. and the reason why is any miner is going to try to be profitable and scale. And they're going to try to use all the power that comes into, whatever their house is or facility is. So on that side, like in terms of like pure energy efficiency, they're going to try to grow to use all the amps they can get, right? So I don't think that in terms of like broader ESG energy savings, it means anything. I could say, oh, we're more efficient, but that would be like not understanding the mining business model. Somewhat similar to real estate. Again, it's like if you had the ability to build apartment buildings, you're going to try to maximize the square footage and return that you're able to build based on zoning, right? Miners are going to kind of do the same thing with electricity. In terms of infrastructure, especially right now, we're in summer, okay? So one thing that a lot of people do not really take into account that mine is actually the cooling costs. You know, if you're in a hot environment and you're running a algorithm that is going to lower your ambient temperature even 10 degrees, that's going to be huge in terms of how you're, displacing heat and maintaining an environment that, basically isn't a sauna. Because some, miners will, they'll suffer in summer. You got to be somewhat strong to have a operation, somewhat even at home in summer, because the heating costs, and cooling, you either are going to, I guess, stomach it and, have a really uncomfortable environment, or you're going to try to maintain the ambient temperature of your space to be a little bit more comfortable and potentially take some stress off of your rigs. So the infrastructure benefits are there. They're obvious in that sense. But that kind of has to do with how a person approaches carrying costs, which, if you're trying to be profitable, that's cost savings. I mean, that's the benefit. It's cost savings based on, your cooling and electricity costs.
Yeah, I'll give the comment now. I think of air conditioning a lot when I think of efficiency. Working with solar, that's one of the major aspects. That and heating your pool, if you have one that you never use and you have it heated all year round, it adds onto your electricity bill, so your utility bill. And when you replace your AC unit and you get a more efficient unit, and then obviously you're going to have it not overstrain as much in the summer months, living in southern states where they are a lot hotter in the summer and things like that. So I kind of just want to draw a quick parallel between GPUs and kind of how important it is to not overstrain them if you want to keep it long term, and then also reduce your overhead costs a bit.
That's one of my favorite things about home miners anyway, is looking at how they work with airflow, how they, oftentimes will find like creative ways to reuse the heat that they generate, and have some secondary utility. I've seen people that heat their driveway with their mining rigs in winter, and heat their pool, and have a heat exchanger. All kinds of really unique like home engineering stuff that I don't know, just makes me happy to see.
Yeah, it's funny because in summer months in a southern tropical state like Florida or California, you're thinking about different challenges on how airflow will affect the lifespan of your GPU cards, and also just overall living environment, how it affects temperature inside the home. But then if you live in another state that has actual snow, which are the majority of US states, then you're trying to think of creative ways on how you can kind of guide that airflow and do different things with it. I've seen, I don't know if it's a gimmick, I don't know if it makes sense, but I've seen like kind of heaters, Bitcoin ASIC heaters that you can buy all well equipped, and you plug it into the side of the home and you put it on in winter, and it actually makes for a good replacement to some sort of heating equipment.
Generally miners love the cold for that reason. It cuts infrastructure costs.
Yeah, it's fun. Anyway, I digress. Moving on, I'd like to talk about the mining pool GetBlock, right? Mm-hmm. I have to interview them. This is like dire necessity for me, right? Because they've effectively opened a beautiful can of worms with the world's first global smart contract enabled smart mining pools. And it seems that miners on Ergo are taking notice. While they're not the most profitable pool short term at the moment, hash rate for GetBlock has skyrocketed over the past few months due to unique value propositions they offer, which are not strictly focused only on finding the most blocks. They focus on other elements currently lacking in almost every other pool across all other chains, which is this idea of sub-pooling to get mining payouts and other tokens that are not inherently mineable, and also user experience, which makes it easy to understand the valuable information for running your mining business through their interface layouts that are just very intuitive and easy to understand. So I'll interview them and ask them more about that. But I want to get your take. What do you find interesting about GetBlock's business model and how it pertains to proof of work mining? And what do you think other mining pools can learn from them?
Sure. I'm a big fan of GetBlock. It's a miner-driven pool, which means they're looking and addressing at issues that miners think about, right? And I don't think that's always the case when it comes to mining pools. In terms of opening subpooling, I think that's probably the biggest area of growth in proof of work in general, probably since Stratum came out and pooling started. In my opinion, it opens a huge frontier that at this point is still super green. Like everything that has been built so far is really great, but I know they're working on a scaling solution. And what happens when projects actually start to see the incentive of launching via work, and then miners are actually kind of, in essence, mimicking like a traditional launch via work, where they are the first, mechanism to kind of hold, create, distribute coins. I think that's going to be huge long term. In terms of like other pools, listen, big pools have done a somewhat decent job developing economic incentives on things like Ethereum, because that's where their focus has been. At this point, Ergo is still small, and so I don't necessarily expect that they're going to throw resources at Ergo and develop much on Ergo until they don't have a choice, right? That's just is what it is. I do think that hopefully longer term, we see more engagement from mining pools, and it's time, resources, energy. It takes an investment to develop on a chain. The bottom line, and right now, GetBlock is far and away the pool that is putting the most time, energy, and investment into really growing out Ergo. Now, in my opinion, a lot of these larger pools aren't doing that because relative to like their net profit margin as a pool, most of it comes from Ethereum. So there's no incentive there to invest in, something that's, right now probably a small part of their reward and fee structure. Now, over time, let's say that, Ethereum does roll out proof of stake. I hope they do a good job with that. Then suddenly it's going to be really interesting because you have all of this GPU capacity that is going to either, look for a secondary, it's going to find a secondary home somewhere, right? Either, a miner is going to probably point to a new chain, or they're going to try to liquidate their assets on the secondary market, which will, get recycled. So some of it will, find a home in gaming or some other use case, but it's still going to most likely be reused, right? And at that point, I think mining pools are going to start looking around and saying, okay, well, what is next? Because they just lost a primary driver of their revenue. And so they're going to try to probably, replace that. Because, mining pools are a business too, ultimately. Or it's just right now, in terms of their profitability and their revenue share, Ethereum is dominant. So why would you invest in something that is, like a minor part of your revenue stream versus something that holds the bulk of it? If you look at MEV, if you look at a lot of the developments that have happened on Ethereum, they do benefit miners, right? So I can't say that mining pools as a whole are not interested in delivering that economic incentive to miners and maximizing it. It's just like priority and incentive right now isn't quite there yet because it doesn't need to be.
Moving on, EIPs are unique in that they can be proposed by anybody in the community, but they are exclusively voted on by miners alone. Over 90% supermajority of hash power has to be reached as a consensus in order to implement a soft fork as well. So given that reality, if we entrust miners to amend the ecosystem of Ergo moving forward, how can we best assure ourselves that the new influx of miners yet to come will understand and also assume this great democratic power responsibly, and also shape the future of Ergo in a way that works for all participants of our community and ecosystem at the end of the day, and not just work for their own incentives alone, which sometimes don't match up. I think of transaction fees and things of that nature. So,
Sure. Well, I'll start at the beginning there. It depends on whether the EIP really has an impact on mining profitability, right? Like you can have an EIP that is for, let's create a specialized standard for utility NFTs, right? That's something that's kind of the developer community has been, looking at, kicking around ideas, talking about. Miners don't really care, right? I imagine that, if that's updated and a reference client comes out, most miners won't even, really care about that type of EIP because it's more about setting a software standard. Versus you do have something like the node upgrade that's on testnet. That actually works in their favor in terms of profitability because it increases, the potential transactions per block, which is, in alignment with their incentives. Now, the reality is there is not a business in the world that I'm aware of, unless you have like some lucrative government contract or something, that doesn't have to balance, cost and competitiveness, right? Mm-hmm. That's just always the case. So if miners, let's say try to extract too much value from the network, right, they're going to lose users. And if they lose users, they lose transactions fees. They're going to ultimately, kind of debase their own market and not be competitive. Now, one unique aspect of that is subpooling itself is possible because of the transaction fees on Ergo. Now, my personal opinion and what I kind of advocate for on the development side is we certainly can create alternative revenue streams for miners, right? That makes transaction fees less of a critical economic driver for long-term security. I think, having the ability to launch via subpooling is going to be a big part of that. I think storage rent is going to be a big part of that, to where like the traditional survivability of proof of work in other coins, like the assumption is transaction fees are going to carry the network post the emission schedule. I think that's wrong. Like, I don't think that's going to work out ultimately. Looking at how, like, even in Ethereum, most of the, let's say, gas costs and just fees itself was creating an incentive to move to layer 2, escape those high fees. And so if everybody escapes those high fees and the majority, move to the lower fee environment, over time, that's going to create a problem to where even, in Bitcoin, if everybody moves to Lightning, good luck, paying for your security incentive. It's not going to make sense. So in my opinion, long-term, that's a huge liability that, is not really discussed enough. It's something that at this point, even you could look at like Adam Beck from Bitcoin, his perspective at this point is it's unknown, but we'll probably figure it out, which, that's a problem when you're talking about potentially like $1 trillion network. You should have some plan in place and make sure that you at least have, let's say a game plan moving into that. I don't think Bitcoin will, run into that problem for, probably another 4 halvings or so. But I think inevitably that's going to be a big open question in proof of work is post emissions. How do you carry the network? How do you incentivize security? Because ultimately we're going to hit that point. And right now it seems like the common solution is to say, well, I'll be dead. Not my problem, right? And that's like a critical a critical assumption for the long-term survivability of these networks that we really need to think about. Not just in Ergo, but I think all proof of work really needs to consider, because that security incentive is what sets the market for mining.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. I thank you for answering those questions. So now we're going to open up the discussion. I've been waiting to do that. So yeah, no, thank you for your thoughtful answers. I'll start with the 15 minutes we have, starting from the end. Your comments on Bitcoin. Yes. So by 2036, you have 99% of Bitcoin all mined. Okay. Like you said, if you depend on taking everything off chain, what do you leave as an incentive for miners on chain? It's going to be literal Bitcoin dust by today's standards that people are supposed to be fighting for. And as they scale their ASIC farms and mining business, how are you going to keep this mining difficulty, network difficulty going up, but yet you don't have anything to replace the actual miner incentives? And that's actually one of the things I think is really strong with Ergo. These ideas of there has to be something, not only for the tail emission of Erg now with the IP27 being there, but also something to add on to it. Yeah. And the incentives that are added on also have to do with the activity of a network, from transaction fees to updating your UTXO boxes, or at least the wallet where those UTXO boxes are, so they don't begin to be taxed for inactivity, which incentivizes more activity. All of these things that, in my past where I've come into conflict with maximalists of Bitcoin, they're like, well, I don't believe my assets should be taxed or eroded over time. But at the same time, it's like, what are the solutions that you're going to have, that you're bringing to the table for your own dilemma that is literally 10 years away, 15 years away, if not sooner? And I urge everybody, whether you're a Bitcoin maximalist or not, just go on Google Images and go look at one of those really big charts where you can see the halving cycles for Bitcoin. And you're going to see, like, the first 20 years, it makes sense. And the other, 110 years that they want until 2130?
It approaches zero at a halving rate. The reality is there some potential that they build solutions on top of Bitcoin that are taxed enough that it kind of pays the transactions fees? Maybe, but at this point it doesn't exist, right? At this point, it does seem like layer 2 solutions ultimately are a way to escape fees. So then it's a matter of saying, okay, well, can there be enough adoption that it offsets that fee minimalization on layer 2 or layer 3 or whatever they're going to try to build on top of? It's a big open question. I think that having storage rent, yes, is controversial, but it comes from Ergo being a community that started with solo miners, right? So if you're solo mining, you have to essentially run your own node. So whatever the block history is, whatever the size of that is, you have to carry. And we have seen blockchains that are growing at a rate where, in 2 decades, okay, yeah, storage capacity will increase, but chains will get heavier and heavier and heavier.
Yep.
And plus, we also see, with the introduction of like native assets, NFTs, Ergo, that is still relatively small. But if you look at larger chains where that's I would say more of a developed economy, whatever that means, you may have people that are dropping 10,000 NFTs all the time, and so then it's on miners to carry that history, even if it's just a project that someone did once, didn't really go anywhere, times 100 every day, right? That's a lot of storage space over time that potentially can add up. And then it's from like the perspective that we came with for storage rent, it's saying, okay, well, you do have chain bloat, you do have dust that needs to be recycled, but you also have something that you could look at as like a value per byte mechanism, right? Where if you look at the overall chain value and then you look at the size of it, what's the value per byte? That's something that if you're going to be carrying the chain and through time, that's something you want to basically increase. The value per byte of space, because, you know, I know we live in a society that's gotten really used to cloud computing, and, you know, you have X gigabytes for free, but you're also the product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not to go off of the main theme of Ergo here, but I think one of the things that, for example, Nervos Network, part of the UTXO Alliance, that's one of the main things that they look at as well. Common knowledge bytes, you know, 1 byte. How do you kind of use that for almost like on-chain rent and all of these different economic incentives, where if you want to store something on chain, you have to have the bytes, which are the actual token of the chain. So it's kind of providing value through the native asset that way as well. But you're right. One of the things that I find very unique about Ergo is that, okay, I mean, it's almost human nature. You create something, and as adoption exponentially grows, for example, in Ethereum's case, which is, you know, just very easy to relate to at this point for the shortcomings that it has. You grow exponentially, and then you run into scaling problems, right? It's almost like you're not future-proofing your chain responsibly enough at times. It almost feels that way. You know, it's hard to say if the teams are really genuinely looking at that long-term survivability. But what I find with Ergo is that instead of waiting for the market cap to dictate if we have solutions to long-term problems, Ergo has long-term solutions before the market cap reaches a point where maybe those are going to flex their muscles the strongest, you know, and that's something unique. Just building things in a proper way is almost like building a highway infrastructure before you have the cars, all the cars necessary, where it would justify the soundness of the structure. And just starting off of there first before saying, oh my God, we don't have, you know, the load capacity is too much or whatever, you know, sure. Engineers will
like
know more about
scaling that. Scaling is a good topic to discuss, because in my opinion, every chain at some point is going to hit a threshold where the block space in the network becomes scarce, and it creates competition, right, for a scarce resource. Now, you know, I know in Ergo's case, it's actually pretty generic in design, to where, you know, we have the capacity to plug in multiple scaling solutions. And then the bigger question is one of more like a engineering perspective, what makes sense where? And hopefully over time, what we see is, you know, open source documentation, guides, you know, pros, cons, coming out as people spin up different scaling solutions, and then we start to see projects plug in what makes sense for them.
Yeah. Going back previously to subpooling, I'm in 100% agreement with you that having some subpooling changes the nature of the game. You don't have to develop your own blockchain now in order to get a fairly mined distributed asset across the miners. You can already bootstrap yourself to Ergo's ecosystem and take on all of the work already done here. And, you know, ultimately it would be up to the project creators to, you know, create enough incentive for people that would want to actually mine that thing that's new versus actual Erg. But that I think for the evolution of proof of work, you're going to need subpooling for all major blockchains in this space.
It depends. It depends on what they want to do. Like, I don't know if Bitcoin will ever get to the point where it, you know, directly supports native assets or something.
Oh, that's a different thing, though, because Bitcoin is, you know, Bitcoin aside for all of this, we're talking about technology that actually wants to improve over time, not just stay stagnant, right? So, yeah, for most of the GPU minables or even ASIC friendly protocols, I think it's going to be more difficult to sustain proof of work for major protocols, since we're going to have more of a democratic competition now that ETH is leaving. Everybody can kind of have like a bit of a hash power reset and kind of begin to question, okay, which one, where do I want to park my hash power towards, and why? And is there going to be a home for me in 10 years time? Will we be abandoned just like Ethereum abandoned us because they decided to switch over to something else? So I think kind of the content of the character of the chain will also come into question more, as miners also want to ensure that their business actually has a home for a chain that will be profitable over time. And I think subpooling is almost a necessity in order to get away from a lot of the shadier projects on proof of stake, where you kind of keep everything for yourself and then you're going to distribute it out and you have an insider token allocation, this and that. That's not to say proof of stake is inherently flawed, in my opinion. It has different use cases and the game theory and the mechanics are just going to be different than proof of work, and that's fine. But if we're talking about if we're going to talk about liquidity pools, if we're going to talk about airdropping things and try to give things that inherently didn't start with any value and not have any work behind it, it's kind of like, if I go cut sugarcane in a field, I'm providing the work before I could sell it at the market. I'm not going to give everybody sugarcane and then create a market around all of this diluted supply of sugarcane. It's a lot more transparent if you were to use subpooling to launch your asset. That's all I think.
I think that also there's another unique factor for people that actually care about decentralization is if you launch in a developed distributed network via subpooling, over time projects are from day one. How many miners were on Ergo? Not as many as today, right? So you do actually have an ability to have a fairer launch even than Ergo had, because you already have the mining infrastructure built versus, like day one, sure, you always have some miners that are like, okay, well, this is a highly speculative thing that I'm going to mine and, I'll keep it in the wallet usually for a while. And if anything ever happens with that project, I probably got maximum block rewards and, we'll have some like lotto investment. That's a common thing. Usually, when there's a new proof of work chain out there, there will be some miners that hop on just for that like potential. But you have to bootstrap a mining community, and that is painful because the economic incentives, if it's done fairly, aren't there. Like, your access to market usually sucks. It takes time to kind of grow and get some, adoption, market traction, and build kind of the demand side. So actually having subpooling is a better distribution than just starting a network because you already have that base infrastructure.
Right. Before I let you go, to wrap this interview up, looking ahead at the future, what do you hope the future of Ergo mining looks like apart from the things that we talked about? Or, do you anticipate any soft forks coming to pass in the long-term future? And actually, I had a second copy of the paper, so I'm going to re-rip that up.
I think like market-wide, the bigger open question at this point is going to be what happens with ETH, and then what happens with all that capacity. How does the market react? That's a big unknown. I don't know the outcome there. I'm curious to see. I think that Ergo certainly has the ability to kind of evolve proof of work a little bit to where not only do you have like this base token that kind of proof of work was, let's say, built around in Bitcoin, but having the ability to launch new assets that have actual, use case utility via work is really huge. And my hope is that, in a combination with storage rent and with the ability to bring new projects to market via work becomes perpetual, right? And so ultimately miners kind of become the shareholders of that whole on-chain economy. Like if you were to go back to Ethereum, when it first launched and you were to have something similar, you would have people that would, I guess Uniswap or whatever didn't have a token, but if they did, you could potentially be like a stakeholder in large projects on top of it, which all of a sudden you have a community that's kind of been bootstrapped around a project. you have, just a better mechanism of adoption than, airdrops are just painful, to be honest. Who's to say that it's not one guy that's just like copy paste the same wallet address? And some people use exchange addresses. It gets wild, messy.
Yeah, we should be wary of actors trying to create value out of nothing. That's exactly what Bitcoin was created to avoid. So
I think ultimately, the best course is to simply stick with things that have use, utility, and value versus just speculation, because speculation lasts until it doesn't.
Oh, we see that going on right now with a lot of the liquidations in the marketplace. When push comes to shove, a lot of weak foundations will crumble, and that's as old as mankind itself. I mean, just anything. If you don't have sound foundations, when hard times come, whether it be a building in Wyoming that went, it was on the edge of the water or the river, it'll just go. I mean, time speaks for itself, and we should if we're gonna be here long term, and Ergo's gonna be here long term, and crypto will be here long term. If you want to be along for that ride, developing strong foundations, as unsexy as it may be, or as disciplined as it may be, is ultimately the best outcome. And for what it's worth, Bitcoin does a good job of being immutable on purpose, so it can be here long term, at least, as it pertains to the infrastructure they built. But obviously that comes with problems like
I would say Bitcoin did an amazing job at being a distributed, unstoppable money, right?
Yes.
But in terms of like Ergo is not really trying to be Bitcoin. What we're trying to do is create a distributed, unstoppable economy based on work. And that just brings in, the functionality that's possible. So, in my opinion, having the ability to launch via work builds on that, because anybody, anywhere in the world, absent, any type of KYC, all they need is hardware and an internet connection, can participate in bootstrapping that, which is huge.
Huge. Yeah. NEPA piles as well, light clients, if you're in a low bandwidth setting. So anyway, we could talk forever. I know you're short on time. And
I'm already a few minutes late to my next thing. It's all right. Don't forget me. I hope.
Well, hey, I want to thank you again for taking this on short notice, and thank you for your input. I'm going to make sure this gets out to community actually today, so we can just hit the ground running. And everyone, follow Joe and check out Ergo if you haven't already. Thank you so much, Joseph.
Yeah, you're welcome. Have a good one.
You too. Thank you. Bye. Thank you for tuning in.